Good afternoon, everyone from London. Welcome to the first virtual roundtable of the year from our side. Today, we're going to be discussing the topic of responsible AI, which is actually the fourth, but certainly not the least pillar of the index. We've covered talent, innovation, and leadership, and today we're covering responsible AI and the insight report that we released recently. It is probably one of the trickiest and probably the thorniest of the pillars that we cover. The data availability is one thing, but also with the pace with which AI is developing right now and the responsible AI and the governance side to keep up is certainly one that everyone is trying to work out how to do best and at pace. And to this, we're very fortunate to be joined by two great thinkers and speakers on this. Paul Dongha, who's head of responsible AI and AI strategy at NatWest, and Raquel Ettrick Thompson, who's global head of AI governance and controls at BNY. And we're going to be guided by the great moderator and our head of intelligence, Colin Gilbert from Evident. And I'm going to hand over to Colin in a second. But before we do that, I just wanted to thank you both, Paul and Raquel, for lending your time and expertise to this discussion for the next hour. But I also wanted to remind everyone who's joining the call today, please do weigh in with questions. This is really a debate among, well, of course, to hear the great speakers, but also among peers and people grappling with this topic day in and day out. So do please put your questions in the chat and we will go to them throughout the hour and also reserve some time at the end to get to any remaining questions that there might be. But just to put some context around this, as you know, we publish the Evident AI Index. We release the index once a year. So the most recent release was back in October last year. So we're about 5 months into this refresh and starting to gather the data again in a couple of months' time for the release of the 2025 index that will be released in October. But if we hop to the next slide, so what we are just within this index, the transparency of responsible AI is an attempt to measure the extent to which the banks are focusing on responsible AI, as evidenced by the publication of thought leadership, the establishment of key partnerships, hiring of dedicated responsible AI talent, and the promotion of AI principles. And so with these metrics that are weighed slightly less in the index, it weighs 10%, this pillar. It is absolutely the part of the index that has been changing the fastest and has seen the most dynamism in the past year. And with that, I am going to hand over to Colin to take us through some more of the data from this pillar and then go to questions to Paul and Raquel. Over to you, Colin.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alexandra. And also a huge shout out to my colleague, Sam Meeson, who's on the call, manning the phone banks, looking for critical questions from the audience. Sam was obviously the co-author on this report and did a lot of the heavy lifting for the subject matter interviews. For anyone who's downloaded the report, you've probably noticed a couple things. One, it's very rich in terms of anecdotal evidence from subject matter experts and practitioners. In fact, we interviewed over a majority of those top 15 banks in the transparency pillar that Alexandra just highlighted on the previous slide. It also is a little bit different from our past insight reports in the sense that it uses the Evident AI Index methodology as a jumping off point to define the current state of play with regards to RAI. But it very quickly drives towards where banks are investing and in what order they're making those investments, as summarized by a draft maturity model that's depicted here on the screen right now. So very much this report is forward-looking, trying to kind of begin to define what the bank of tomorrow looks like with regards to responsible AI. And our initial conclusions from the report is that from both a quantitative perspective and a qualitative perspective, many of those leading banks that Alexandra just profiled are distinctive in a couple ways. First is that they very much are balancing investments across people, policies, and processes, which is a framework we're going to kind of adopt for the discussion today. And they're also further characterized by hiring dedicated RAI personnel and expanding education and training in terms of people, mapping AI principles to controls while also investing heavily in explainable AI research in terms of policy, and then starting to really share the building blocks and the best practices to enabling AI insurance that allow banks to graduate from low risk use cases to moderate use risk cases and beyond that as they move up the slope, in the words of one of our interviewers, in terms of processes. So this is where I want to start to bring in kind of our panelists today. And we're going to quickly deep dive into each of these three sections in rapid fire order, but starting off at a higher level of altitude. When you look at kind of this very simplified draft framework, there's obviously a lot of moving pieces here that involve a lot of cross-team stakeholders. So my initial question is basically, for one of those banks that's not in the top 15, how does one get started? And I wanted the panelists to draw on their own experience. And Raquel, at Symposium and in our interviews, you really drew from a very kind of scientific method of moving from guardrails to governance. Can you kind of summarize that approach for our audience?
Sure. I think for us, it's, if you think about the triad of people, process, and technology, one of the things that we went back is to look at the NIST RMF as a starting foundation point. That NIST RMF allowed us to help align from our risks, novel risks specifically that AI poses, because as you know, BNY Mellon has been creating models for over 5 years. It's just in the last 2 years that we've sort of governed it and centralized it into a central hub that we're calling Hub. But triangulating between the policies, the risks and controls, as well as the training, so that there is a bit of a triad between the people, process, and policy, just like it says in the Evident AI report. From an overall standpoint, you have to make sure that you understand not only the existing risks that are posed, but also these novel new ones as the industry continues to change for things like generative AI. From our standpoint, one of the things that was crucial in that work is the mapping and alignment and gap assessment of the RMF and understanding where govern, manage, and mapping comes into play. I think one of the biggest and hardest pieces of all that is the monitoring piece. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, when it comes to looking at all of the solutions, all of the agents, all of the initiatives that are coming into play, how do you create one standardized way in order to manage that? And a part of that has to come with having a dedicated function of people who tailor the solutions, who tailor the monitoring, who tailor the controls, who tailor the risk, and tailor the policies according to the output and the success criteria for each of the models and the agents. So long and short answer to say that you have to focus on, one, understanding the people, understanding the policies, and how the processes work together in order to best be able to govern, map, and manage your functions related to AI and responsible AI. Regulation becomes key here as well. As we see the regulatory landscape is continuing to evolve globally, staying on your toes in terms of staying up to speed with those things, and symposiums as well as roundtables like these are a good forum to help continue to make sure that you're staying connected. As a global company, for us, it's imperative not only to focus on things like the EU AI Act, but also there's local and state ordinances and orders that are continually issued, and having processes in place that help you to monitor the horizon of those regulatory changes is a core part of ensuring that all three of the people, policy, and process is best aligned to your legal, regulatory, data, privacy, and other requirements.
Thanks, Raquel. And I think you really hit the nail on the head on a challenge that a lot of the wider index feels with regards to this, is that even on this slide, it's easy to look at this in terms of silos, in terms of balancing investments across each of these areas to ensure they're moving in lockstep. Paul, my question for you is, and this is, I have mixed feelings about maturity models in the sense that they do capture the current state of play. And to be effective, I think they have to be a living document where the definition of whatever level 4 and level 5 is really reflects kind of the current status quo as opposed to what was yesterday or the year before. The other critique, I think, of a lot of maturity models is that not everything fits conveniently into one of these 18 boxes, which Raquel just kind of reminded us of in terms of how you have to look at them individually, collectively, and in tandem with one another. Can you think of things that don't fit conveniently into one of these boxes because it's cross-cutting, recognizing that you've done a lot of work on sustainability and the challenges for scaling AI with regards to the energy footprint, the hardware waste, the water required, as everything just is expected to turn faster and faster and bigger?
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, Colin and Alexandra, thanks for having me on. I think people, policy, and processes is one part of it. Technology and kind of accountability are, in my mind, also two of the biggest things that we have to get right. And let me just touch on accountability. So accountability means having people involved, but having the right governance set up within the organization, using people and their roles. So ensuring that risks are covered through things like a policy is just one step. But of course, you need model risk governance as well to go with it. And you need things like AI governance, which is kind of new, that also needs to go with it. So augmenting people, policy, and process with these other aspects, I think, is crucial. So governance and accountability being one of those. I mentioned technology as well. Technology tooling that allows model developers to surface metrics in the model development process, I also think is really, really important. We're used to having policies that give requirements of what must be true. So policy will state things like, for bias, for fairness, for explainability, there must be a rigorous process in place. But how do you evidence that? And how do you demonstrate you're able to do it? Well, for me, that's where the technology comes in place. So we need technology components within the model development lifecycle that surface those metrics and can therefore demonstrate that policy requirements are being met. And that's something that certainly we're doing at NatWest, and I know other organizations are doing as well. I think the other part that you mentioned was on sustainability, Colin. And this is certainly a subject that is close to my heart. The proliferation of kind of copilot technology, generative AI, and certainly agentic AI means that there's no shortage of appetite in the future to launch Gen AI models for all sorts of tasks, especially knowledge worker tasks. And I think organizations should bear in mind the carbon and energy footprint that the models and their use of models will have. And I think that needs to be weaved into, the risk management process that banks have and tied into wider sustainability targets. And that practice is starting to emerge. I'm really happy to say people are now discussing this as a problem and as something that needs to be managed as part of enterprise risk management.
And just one quick follow-up on that, because, oh, sorry, Raquel, I think I interrupted.
No, I was just going to say to that point, I mean, Paul brings up a really great point around sustainability and investment, right? A part of balancing the risk is also the financial risk, right? How much investment are we going to make in things like infrastructure? And what is the expected return on that investment? And so really, companies are really starting to look at the commercialization of this and wanting to actually see the value and how you quantify that value. And it triangulates well with what Paul said around the technical components supporting. The monitoring that I mentioned is obviously can't be done by human individuals at all times. So having automated controls and mechanisms in place that allow us to do some of that monitoring is paramount, right? Otherwise, we're creating models and automating some tasks, but then ultimately ending with other tasks that create more need for manual effort and human in the loop. So
absolutely. And I think we'll get into a lot more of that. And we're getting good audience questions already, wanting to kind of fast forward to the policies and the processes and get to the good bits sooner rather than later. Alexandra, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, no, I know we have so many questions that we wanted to get through, but there is one particular one in the chat that I thought would be a really good point in time to bring to both Paul and Raquel, because you're touching on it with the process question here. But it's from Rose Landry, and her question is, are those AI risk management functions integrated to traditional lines of defense, or do they constitute a separate set of processes and practices? Curious to hear more about integration into existing governance frameworks. And I just wondered if you might comment on that, because this, as you both have talked about, is all about adapting lines of defense to AI-specific risk, to Gen AI-specific risk, and Raquel, also to your point about agentic AI-specific risk, which does push this question around automated monitoring that comes up with the agentic AI, oversight in particular. But I wonder if you might each of you both quickly comment on this sort of. Does it keep in place the current lines of defense structure, or do we need to actually, do we need to think about whether there are other ways of implementing this oversight?
Raquel, do you want to go first? Or?
Sure, I could start. Paul, I think gone are the days that we can say that the three lines of defense are completely disparate from each other, right? And that's probably an unpopular thing to say, but there has to be some handoffs between first, second, and third line in terms of managing risks. Second line is always going to check and challenge, but they also have to provide insight and inputs into some of the processes and policies that first line puts in place. Otherwise, we're not adequately looking at the entire picture. Third line, as mentioned, is always going to audit and check what first and second line have done. But at the end of the day, there has to be a bi-directional dialogue. And that's what I mean by the fact that all three lines of defense have to collaborate together. It can't just be that they're independently setting one standard or expectation in third line and second line, and first line is operating in a completely different way. And so all that to say is, while there is sort of still that healthy tension that has to occur in terms of managing risk between the three lines of defense, in terms of use cases like this, where there is such cross-pollination across various functions, from data to privacy to legal to engineering to HR, there has to be the ability to have that bi-directional dialogue. Otherwise, the firm will not be successful. I don't know, Paul, what do you think? I know that's a little controversial, but...
No, actually, I think in answer to your question, Alex, I don't think there's a binary answer, right? In my point of view, the well-established enterprise risk management frameworks that a lot of firms have with the first, second, and third lines of defense, we should reuse as much of that apparatus as we can. And I think NIST also is very much in favor of that. But I think all of them need to be augmented and maybe uplifted. So, for example, where data privacy and security overlap with ethical and responsible AI, I think we need to uplift some of those policies and some of those practices, so your security folk and your data privacy folk understand the risks that generative AI can introduce with respect to their areas. So I think those three lines of defense, keep them in place, uplift the governance forums that look after those risks with ethical AI knowledge. And I think augmenting in another way as well. So ethical impact assessments are ones that have been introduced, I think, in many banks to look for specific risks to do with AI. Things like bias and unfairness, explicability, data leakage with respect to IP data in Gen AI. So there are specific risks that Gen AI and certainly AI has introduced, which can be captured in an ethical impact assessment. Sometimes it's an algorithmic bias assessment. So I think those assessments can be integrated into the existing lines of defense as an additional form of assessment that can sit alongside privacy impact assessments and security assessments. There is also, it brings forward the potential overhead and burden of additional assessments. So I think banks have to be really cognizant that those assessments don't overlap, and that they look for the specific risks within those assessments.
Yeah.
I think the final part is on model monitoring. So I think, Raquel, as you said, I certainly think the model monitoring activities need to be uplifted quite significantly to look for things like model drift, concept drift, and those concepts are far more pernicious than they were with traditional machine learning models, which we always talked about model drift, but for ML it was kind of understood, right? And I think for Gen AI it's really not quite well understood. So I think more focus on model monitoring once models are live needs to be uplifted.
Yeah, I'm going to hand back over to you, Colin. But I think this question around, when you're given a domain specific personal AI agent, right, and your agents are starting to communicate with each other and solve problems, with each other, which is already being deployed in banks. I guess this question around when agent to agent activity happens, how do you monitor that? To your last point, Paul, which is like belongs in that last category, and how are banks thinking about that? But I'm sure that question is, I know that question is going to come up later on and definitely in the chat. But I'll hand back to you, Colin.
Yes. How we solve the agentic challenge is definitely in the bonus round questions. But I think the last question regarding how the lines of defense are evolving is a very good bridge to talk about people and talent and how roles and responsibilities are changing in this context. So Evident looks at talent very, very closely. And one of the reasons we do is because we think it's an early warning sign for basically deeper changes that are happening throughout the organization. And when we look at our definition of RAI talent in terms of the degree to which responsible AI is working its way into titles, into skills, into job descriptions, into job profiles, et cetera, one of the things that we found a couple things obviously in the data. The first is that, we found a corpus of about 250 staff with RAI titles or responsibilities across the 50 banks in the index. This is a small base of people, given that the AI talent stack is measured in tens of thousands of people, but it's growing incredibly fast year over year, increased 41% between November 2023 and October 2024. The number of banks featuring these types of profiles increased from 31 out of 50 banks to 41 out of 50 banks. The number of banks with dedicated RAI leaders doubled from 15 banks to a majority of over 33 banks. And in parallel to all of these developments with regards to people, we now find 29 out of 50 banks have set up AI risk or AI specific governance committees or adapted previous working groups to serve that function. So an amazing amount of change over the surface that suggests other things that we're going to get into next. And so one of the things I kind of wanted to start with, Paul, maybe going to you, because you gave us a very good perspective on kind of the pre-Gen AI moment and the post-Gen AI moment in terms of when everything changed. So I'm wondering if you can summarize for our audience, what do you think are the unique features or the risk vectors of AI that necessitate some of the new or rescoped roles that were starting to emerge at this pace of change, especially in your operating environment in Europe?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Colin, for the question. I think you mentioned risk vectors there. We know about the traditional ones, things like bias, lack of transparency, model drift, and we mentioned those. Gen AI has obviously introduced more risk vectors, new risk vectors, IP data leaks, hallucinations. So I think in terms of skills, to find the right people with the right talent, to have an appreciation of the risks as well as an understanding of how those risks have emerged from a technology perspective, I think is really important. So having someone quite senior in the organization that's able to explain the risks to non-technical folk, particularly in business units, but be able to have conversations with data scientists and machine learning engineers who may not have been exposed to some of the tools that they need and may not really be cognizant of things like unfair bias. Someone that can explain those to technical people and talk about the technology, someone that can have an appreciation for the importance, I think, of diversity within development teams. Right? I think diversity of thought and opinion and background is absolutely critical to development teams, so that we put that culture within teams as well. So really, the model development life cycle from model conception through to model development, right through to deployment, responsible AI needs to feature in those three, as well as within the risk management practice itself. So I think finding the right kind of people with those skills, I mean, it's hard, right? It's hard to be able to find those people. And I think a lot of organizations are training people to join those teams. So we see, and I've certainly witnessed banks with large scale training, comms, awareness programs to explain ethical risks, risks of bias and unfairness across not just engineers, but to non-engineering folk, to data folk, to legal teams, to privacy teams. So I see this culture of ethical AI now being much more widely adopted and a lot more awareness being given to that across in the entire organization. So I think that's obviously a very healthy thing to do. But of course, it needs to be driven from the top, Colin. I think from the top of the organization to really drive things through. So whether that's through an AI officer or a responsible AI officer, something like that, but to have that support from the top of the organization that recognizes AI's got actually huge potential in terms of uplifting the work that we do and kind of delighting our customers. So with that huge potential, though, there are these risks. So as much as we like to talk about the huge potential and how it's going to transform people's lives and give customers much better experiences, I think we have to give equal importance to the risks and how we can mitigate them, because we can mitigate them. It's perfectly doable, but it needs mobilization across the organization, people, process, technology, policies, as we've talked about earlier.
Yeah, and one quick follow-up on that, since you brought up the issue of leadership and defining kind of a point person for RAI in the organization, which we obviously see happening. There was a question from the audience on, do you see banks developing and publishing actual policies versus principles? And what is the interplay between these two from a definitional perspective? So what we see is that one of the first things an RAI leader does is codify and promote and market internally the set of AI principles, which are fairly consistent from a lot of organizations and date back to a lot of the EU working group work from 2018 and 2019. But my question for you is that principles are very public and policies are very private. So what is the next step in moving down that process that Raquel outlined kind of in her opening remarks?
Yeah. So Colin, for us, I mean, policies, I was going to say policies are like a first-class citizen. Policies have. So our organization, once something's in policy, the machinery of risk management kicks in, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is a way to draw down on that policy that compels first and second line of defense colleagues and the governance forums they sit in to take action and to actually, mitigate and use all the controls that are available to mitigate those risks. So policy has a very, very important and very significant role to play and kicks in processes. In my view, principles are things that we would want to adhere to. And I think they're a very, very good way of kind of positioning an organization, say, look, this is what we stand for. These are the things that we take seriously. And those principles have to align with the purpose and values of an organization. So I think it's very hard to tease them apart, right? The principles kind of follow on from the values that the organization holds dear. And some organizations have published them, like we have at NatWest last month, as our AI and Data Ethics Code of Conduct. So we see it as the way that we create AI models and look after people's data. We see it as a code of conduct. It's our rule book. It's what we abide by. But really, to do it properly, the policies have to reflect those as well. So policies have to be updated in line with principles being published so that the machinery of the organization can kick in.
Yeah. And Raquel, to continue that conversation, another thing that RAI leaders do is obviously stand up, organize, chair, or participate in numerous committees and working groups specific to governance and ethics and data privacy and model review and AI impact, and the list goes on and on and on. My question for you is, when you look at the activities of these committees and working groups that are very active at the moment, drawing historical parallels to the internet or the advent of mobile or cloud computing, we've been to this movie before in terms of standing up these committees to address an existential threat from an emerging technology, and a lot of those committees from the last 20 years no longer exist anymore. So my question with regards to the ones we see going on with AI, how do we know when the work is done and when that gets absorbed in any conventional digital transformation into steady state business as normal activities?
Let's just say for the Marvel junkies, these movies are never done, right? There's always some plot twist. There's always some nuance that comes about that helps link to a new story, a new capability, a new skill. So just a movie analogy wise is just a joke, but the reality of it is, as it becomes to RAI activities, the work is really never done. The industry is evolving and changing on a daily, hourly, minute basis. And as it evolves and changes, we have to be able to evolve and change with it. But one of the things that I would say is fundamental, and Paul alluded to it earlier, is just really making sure that there's a connection point between the company's corporate values and the principles and policies that are connected. And so a part of the activities when it comes to governance committees and working groups is managing your external engagement. What I mean by that, participating in forums like Evident. You know, BNY Mellon also participated in the Veritas Consortium as part of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, helping to define the FEAT principles: fairness, ethical, accountable, transparent. Making sure that you're engaged externally as well as internally. And when internally, there's really going to be two prongs of this. And Colin and Alexandra, you both kind of mentioned this in the report. There's the prongs of people that are data scientists and the folks that are actively engaged in creating models. There's the engineers that develop and manage and monitor the technology. But then there's also the business folks that are using things like ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, that are starting to learn and evolve in the world of AI. And at those two facets, and Paul mentioned this before, there has to be someone that can kind of bridge that middle, that is able to translate to the business the capabilities. And so the internal activities, the governance, the working groups, all has to be cross-functional. It has to understand the expected outcome, the value, and the benefit. And that, as a company, is going to continue to change over time. At BNY, we have our core principles. You go up to any employee in the company, they'll be able to tell you what those are, right? Be more for our clients, run our company better, empower our culture. We focus everything that we do across our committees, whether it's AI or otherwise, on those things. And when it comes to things like the working groups specific to a particular initiative, we ensure that they're aligned with the resources and people and talent that know and understand the capability that's being created. So whether it's, analyzing market data and giving market insights to our traders, we make sure that there's a business person that has a seat at the table with those working groups. And as I said, the core fundamental message of the question is really that the work is never done, but it's about making sure that you have the right stakeholders at the table to consistently evaluate not only the industry expectations, the regulatory expectations, the legal expectations, as well as how it aligns to your company value and direction.
Excellent. Oh, I think looking at time, I'm very committed to getting through all three of our frameworks today. So I'm actually going to move on next to policy as a discussion point. And just to kind of tee this up, I think one of the most challenging aspects of putting together the report was we had excellent feedback from everybody who participated in terms of the practicality of mapping AI principles to AI controls in the expectation of growing auditability of AI systems, AI processes, AI models, et cetera. And then we had a lot of feedback on the progress with regards to explainable AI. And with regards to the latter, like the numbers from the index are just pretty staggering. XAI has always been a hot topic in AI research circles, but over the last 3-year period since the index was introduced, those paper publications are up 136%. Today, XAI accounts for 15% of all AI research we see coming out of banks specifically, or authors employed by the banks that are presenting at AI conferences. And this is an area where we also see several banks that don't publish a lot of AI research at large, but they punch above their weight class with XAI specifically. And that's kind of the number in parentheses on this slide, where you see if we're talking about Intesa, or we're talking about UniCredit, or we're talking about Group BPCE, you're talking about large double-digit numbers as a share of XAI over all research coming out. And so one of the things that Sam and I, worked a lot on was trying to, attack the cynic's perspective that people are investing so much in AI controls because return on investment on explainability is farther out by some people's estimation. And I think a great insight from Dan German at Combank was that the two topics are intricately related. And so his quote's on the board here, but to paraphrase from him, knowing the limits of explainability helped Combank and specifically prioritize where they needed to invest in additional mechanisms. In other words, it defined the frontier of the bank's operations as we collectively chip away at the known unknowns. And so I thought that was just really eloquent, and wanted to get, both of your perspective on this idea of both controls and explainability. So maybe, Raquel, I'll go to you first. And just from a very pragmatic perspective, how do you begin to do that mapping process? And continuing from your last theme that the movie's never over, how do you ensure that it's a recursive process and not treated as a one and done process, which we think is a common pitfall that might trap banks at an earlier stage in the maturity model?
So when BNY started, one of the things that was paramount to us to ensure was that we didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater when the hub was established, right? There was already processes in place for managing our enterprise risk management framework. And so everything starts with that risk appetite statement, the risks and controls, and the policies, obviously, as a triangulation. We continue to review the existing processes were in place and make sure that we started to create connection points for those connection points, like, generative AI, where it may touch data, cyber, legal, and evaluate those risks as a start. What are we comfortable with from a risk appetite perspective? Which risks are we willing to mitigate? Which risks are we having to accept? And which risks are we going to invest in to enhance controls from a longer term perspective? And so as part of our journey and our roadmap is our regular and quarterly attestations of our RCSAs, or risk and control self-assessment. We evaluate on a quarterly basis our controls environment as it relates to those risks, as we call them. And at that point, we review, well, are there any net new risks? Are there any net new products? Are there any net new processes that would require additional controls? Have any potential self-identified issues or audit issues been identified during that period that would allow us to do a root cause analysis, that would cause us to do an exercise that would implement other additional new controls? And so it's an iterative life cycle and an iterative process that's been baked to an existing process that already was working and functioning prior to the AI hub being centralized and standardized. So when you look at some of our core examples, like where we have liquidity forecasting capability solutions to help our corporate treasury functions plan and examine various scenarios, and it helps them also be prepared in times of uncertainty. That work required us to then look at that corporate treasury team's controls and say, all right, from a human in the loop perspective, as an example, what additional checkpoints do we need to put in place to the content that's generated in the liquidity forecast that's being generated by this model? And so in that exercise, we identified additional success criteria for that particular model that has to continually be managed, tuned. Is the model continuing to create a 80% success rate in terms of edits that has to be done, 80% or above? And I'm just throwing out numbers. That's not the exact number of that particular one. But all that to say that in the life cycle, as new solutions come out, as new models, new agents are being created, we look at the tenets of the FEAT principles, the fairness, ethical, accountable, transparent, in the review of that model. We make sure that we have the appropriate use of the data, and we make sure that there's always an evaluation of the risk and controls and how they align to the enterprise risk appetite statement and the risk appetite statement for that respective business.
So, and Paul, turning the question over to you in a slightly different way, what Raquel just described as a very deliberate, incremental, iterative, responsible approach to handling all of the risk vectors right now. Looking a little bit further out, what does explainability need to do? What does it need to accomplish to basically future-proof a lot of the systems that are going into play, recognizing that there'll be a lot more scrutiny of the black box problem that Gen AI obviously presents us with?
Yeah, so Colin, thanks for the very difficult question there.
Always.
It is. I think because generative AI obviously brings with it heightened risks and new risks. The models are hugely complex. They're intractable. They don't submit to any kind of explainability type technique that we're used to. Things like Shapley and line values and so on, which were kind of suitable for gradient descent. I'm not aware of anything that's really usable in the same way. Now, for generative AI, there's a lot of focus on grounding. So the ability to surface the right context that accompanies the prompt into the model, and then to ensure that the answer that comes back actually answers the question and is grounded in the context. That seems to be the main thrust at the moment of ensuring that answers from generative AI are safe, are reliable, relevant, and so on and so forth. So there are some metrics that are being developed, and some of the big cloud providers have those as part of their guardrails. And there are fintech companies that are developing technology around that. So that seems to be some of the emerging techniques being used certainly on generative rather than the predictive AI. And yes, and all organizations certainly that I talk to have those as a core part of their infrastructure, right? So the ability to put those guardrails right at the front of their LLM gateway to ensure that everything is logged, and there are filters there as well. There are whitelists. There are small technologies that are being added and augmented to large language models in Gen AI. But from my perspective, the main thing is you can't go into the model and fix the model. You kind of have to put stuff around the model to ensure that nothing harmful goes in and certainly nothing harmful comes out, and then to try and make sure explainability is provided through some tooling rather than from within the model. And that's had a big effect, right? That has a big effect on things like model risk governance, model validation. Because in the old days with model validation, we had our own training data. We could debias the training data. We could put in processing techniques like regularization in the model. So there were techniques to support explainability because we had access to the model and the training data, and it was kind of tractable, right? Generative AI, none of those. We don't have any of those luxuries, so we have to resort to some other mechanism. And the ones I mentioned seem to be some of the emerging mechanisms that we have. I think with respect to future proofing, and I think Colin, you mentioned that, and Raquel, you did as well. I think active engagement with regulators is really important, right? So how do we future proof ourselves? Well, the technology is changing really quickly. The regulators are responding. But I think it's really healthy for banks to have an open, frank conversation with regulators about what's happening within banks and how they see technology developing. I think, and Raquel, you touched on it, horizon scanning, super important. So my responsible AI team work hand in hand with Reg Affairs and our horizon scanning teams. And I think the last thing I'd like to mention in terms of future proofing is having a governance, risk, and compliance system in place that's really tailored towards managing AI risks. And the big change we see there is, rather than model validation, historically model validation was what validation teams and risk teams looked at. And now we're talking about validating systems. And if you go to the EU AI Act, they're really clear about this. An AI system is comprised of many component parts, not just the model itself. So there's everything around training data, other components that go around it, validation routines, and so on and so forth, and some of the guardrails I mentioned. So assuring a system that's comprised of all of those parts is a much bigger exercise. And I'm really glad to see that there are technology platforms now being built, some by new organizations, some being provided by big tech companies that are really looking at assurance of systems rather than just the model behind the system.
Thanks. And Paul, you set up this last question so well. So thank you for that. This is coming in from chat. This is a topic that's near and dear to Alexandra's heart. But basically the question, especially since we have two representatives from opposite sides of the pond on the call with us today, is does the contrasting regulatory environment between North America and Europe change a bank's approach to RAI? And we get a lot of different answers to this, given the fact that elements of the EU AI Act are extraterritorial nature, the fact that global banks are operating in a lot of jurisdictions. And part of the reason that all the banks are investing time in the principles and all of the policies and procedures that we're talking about today basically insulate themselves from that geographic drift or jurisdictional challenges. So hot take from either of you on that topic. Raquel, maybe you first.
Sure. I think if you build and stick to your core principles, you will not go wrong. BNY Mellon is a company that operates in more than 30 markets, as you mentioned, Colin. And we believe that responsible innovation can happen on a global scale while still adhering to regulatory requirements. And look, there's a lot of fodder in the news related to what's going on in North America, and you alluded to our geographic locations. But for us, our focus is continuing to look at reshaping the landscape of financial services. By integrating AI into our core capabilities, we use our core principles of empowering our culture, innovating for our clients. We're not just adapting to the future, we're actively shaping it. We look ahead to look at the next phase of what AI involves. It's about creating new value streams through AI capabilities. Those value streams are going to align to creating the evolution of the financial market infrastructure and helping all of us banks, global, regional, etc., to make sure that we can continue on our transformation journeys in a responsible way by sticking to our core values, our core principles. And that's fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency, and making sure that from a future-proof standpoint, our core always focuses on protecting our clients, protecting our data, and protecting our brand and reputation.
Paul, anything to add? This is your one chance to say the Americans are wrong on this.
I'm not going to go there, Colin. Look, I think, as far as the bank that I work for, NatWest Group, goes, we are aligning to the EU AI Act, right? We have to. From a UK perspective, the UK principles published by the UK government's pro-innovation approach paper, and then the follow-on paper from DCIT very much overlaps with what's in the EU AI Act, right? So they're really, for us, there isn't any difference. So we will take a pragmatic approach and a conservative approach to handling all of those risks. But here's the one thing I want to add. That doesn't necessarily slow down innovation. Right? And a lot of people think, oh my God, all this extra regulation, risk management, it's slowing us down. I don't believe that for 1 minute. I actually think, certainly for large organizations, it gives you certainty and clarity over what you can proceed with. And then you can proceed at pace. So I think that level of certainty, knowing that investment is a worthwhile investment, and you're not going to trip over a regulatory hurdle because you are aware of the regulations, I think that's actually really, really important. And my second point is that I think a lot of people look at the responsible AI folks and go, "Oh God, you're here to tell us we can't do something." Well, that's kind of yes, but I think that's a bit dated. I think a lot of work in responsible AI is about ensuring that the model or the AI system that's developed does what it's supposed to do and doesn't do what it's not supposed to do. So when we look at large generative AI models, certainly, models like, Gemini and Llama and so on, the very large models, they can generate a huge amount of text and tokens. There's a lot of it we don't want it to do. And I think the responsible and ethical AI folk are here to tell us we need to engineer our systems on top of those models so we stop those harmful outputs coming out of the model. And that's about as much as creating a competent AI system, right? A fit for purpose AI system, an accurate AI system. So stopping it doing what it shouldn't do is just as important as having engineers that make it do what it should do. So I like to think far more of the technical work that responsible AI does is about accuracy. It's about making the model competent rather than saying no to something.
Yeah.
I hope other people would share that view as well.
No, Paul, what I like to say is responsible AI is enabling people to ideate in a way that says yes on the right path, right? People look at regulation as daunting, but the reality of it is if you map the EU AI Act, the Utah Act, the California Privacy Act, as we've done aligned to our controls, there's overlap everywhere. And people are daunted by just looking at a regulation. The reality of it is most of the time it's reinforcing something you already have with slight nuances that you can tweak. So it's about enabling the business to do things in the right way, as opposed to saying no, which is what people often think.
Excellent. And both of you've set us up so well to go into the third and final act as we enter kind of the final 10 minutes of the broadcast. One of the provocations that was included in the introduction to the report that came from both of you and all the other subject matter experts we interviewed was this provocation that RAI does not hamper innovation if you do it right, and if you're at the head of that maturity model, it can actually spin the wheel faster. And the penultimate page of the report really goes through best practices and case studies specific to each bank that are on the record, whether that's human in the loop or whether that's looking at AI governed by design in the case of CIBC, or looking at monitoring systems and technical guardrails in ELIZA, BNY. The thing that I want to kind of conclude with in terms of process is that at the top of, I think, the hype cycle and the waves at Gartner and Forrester respectively are this idea of an automated AI assurance platform. And I want to focus on kind of the building blocks that allow us to get there. And so first going to Raquel, what you just described in terms of being able to handle regulatory guidance more effectively, does that same logic apply to overcoming the bottleneck issue with deploying new tools and solutions to first-line operators? And do these policies, processes, and people collectively allow you to actually get to what all of the leadership wants, which is time to deployment when we come to the scaling of promising emerging AI use cases on a risk-adjusted basis?
So I'll say that on our learning journey over time, we definitely evolved on the bottleneck issue. To start, I think we looked at every solution, every process, every model, every initiative the same. What we've done now to deal with the bottleneck issue is we've pared down based on a risk-based approach, the approach to the governance for what's being done. So as an example, if you are one of the capabilities that we implemented, it was a generative AI solution that helps our employees find benefits information faster, right? That information is publicly available. They can go on the intranet. They can find that on our My HR page. But what ELIZA, which is our core platform, does is help them to ask questions of those documents and summarize it. In cases like that, where they're using publicly available information that's available to the employees, we've reduced the governance pathway to a lower risk level, such that there are less toll gates that you go through to be able to use those types of solutions. So as an example, if an agent is being created by someone, that agent is being shared across the team for the exact same use case, as opposed to each individual employee then having to go get approval to use that agent. We've garnered a enterprise use approval for that, and there's a different governance pathway for that. So in terms of the bottleneck, based on the risk that is being posed by what's being done, whether it's an initiative or an enterprise solution, like evaluating the use of Microsoft Copilot, it's a very different questionnaire. It's a very different governance pathway. It's a very different forum and set of approvals that have to happen. That was the only way we were able to start propagating more potential uses of AI across our firm, to the point where we're now at over 50% of our staff is trained on the use of our tool, ELIZA, across the board. And that's of almost 50,000 plus employees. And we'll continue to do more. But the idea is we are regularly working with our governance and controls working group that has cross-functional representation from our legal, compliance, risk, first line audit, etc., to look at the feedback from our use cases and look at how we can continue to reduce the time to market per se by still keeping the risk at the forefront, but evaluating the processes that are aligned to them to make sure that they are aligned to the commensurate risk.
Excellent. And Raquel, can you remind our audience where the name Eliza comes from? I think it's one of the coolest trivia tidbits.
Yes, so Eliza is actually named after Alexander Hamilton's wife, one of the founders of our company. And so most of you know we celebrated our 240th year anniversary over a year ago. And we've continued to stay steadfast in the principles that started our company from Alexander Hamilton. We felt like it was a good tribute to his wife to name our platform after her.
And so everybody in attendance now has their trivia tidbit, especially if they're Hamilton fans, for dinner and cocktail hour tonight. Yes. Paul, last question for you. It's a big one. You got 2 to 3 minutes to answer it. And I'm going to combine this with a trending audience question too, is that I think different people mean different things when they talk about an assurance platform, but I'd like kind of your definition and the degree to which you think it's the end destination for a lot of the ongoing efforts that we talked about today. And the audience spin on it is we didn't talk about vendors and partners at all in the hour. And so to what degree can the assurance platform basically extend everything that is being done inside the four walls of the bank, extend that to critical partners, given that dependency when we enter the world of AI?
Yeah. I mean, AI assurance is kind of an interesting word because for many lawyers, they'd run a mile, right? That would be like legal assurance over AI. This is a really, really thorny problem. When I use the word AI assurance, I don't mean in the legalistic sense of the word. I really mean that it's something that you have as a central part of your governance, risk and compliance. If you want to demonstrate good risk management and you want to evidence it, you need a platform that allows you to surface that. You need a platform that the board can look at and say, we know where all our AI risks are across all of our systems in totality, because we have a centralized system that captures, monitors and tracks our risk management efforts around AI. So I see it from a centralized platform perspective, which is a single place people can go to say across our portfolio of AI systems in the bank, whether they're in development or whether they're deployed, there's a place you can go where you can see all of the steps that the system went through in order to ensure all of the risks of AI were mitigated and adequately covered. And there's a trail there. There's an auditable trail with various sign-offs that allow you to see all of that. So that's really what I think of when I say AI assurance. And I think, Colin, to your other question, a lot of banks, of course, use third-party models. Work with a lot of vendors. We have software as a service, or we have singular AI models that come in from vendors. Well, all of those models and the systems built around them need to be put into and recorded within that AI assurance platform, just as we would for a model that we develop within the organization. So third-party models and the risk management activities that we would undertake to ensure that those models have been developed ethically and responsibly, we should hold those vendors to the same standard and account that we hold our own development teams to. So I don't think there's a difference between the approach we take with our third-party vendors versus the approach that we take with our own development teams. And if I may, in a few seconds, I think you mentioned something earlier, Colin, automated AI assurance. I don't think very much of this should be automated. I think we should put deliberate controls that we say are human controls, that it actually needs someone to step in and look at something and read a document and not leave it to things like LLM as a judge, right? I think some of the conversations I'm seeing is saying, oh, we've got Gen AI risks, but I know what we can do. We can use an LLM to check whether the Gen AI model was right or wrong. I kind of find that hard to get used to because you're using the same technology to assess technology you don't quite understand. So I think then we have to be very conscious about where we draw the line between what humans are responsible for in an AI assurance versus what machines are responsible for. I don't have time to go into the details, but I will leave that for now.
I think that's an excellent shout out and caveat with a word of caution at the end of the session. We are right on time against all of my expectations. I want to say a huge shout out to both Raquel and Paul, everybody who contributed to the report, the wider Evident community for asking such good questions on the call today. And Alexandra, back to you to do any housekeeping or take us home.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Paul and Raquel. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, I don't know if you've been following the chat, but so many great questions to you. Many of them were covered about question on human in the loop, impact of the EU AI Act, questions on, the data governance aspect and on and on and on. But we'll capture all of that and send it to you. But a huge thank you to you both for covering a very big topic in just these 60 minutes. One quick shout out is to say that in addition to the report on responsible AI, we've also just released our use case tracker that lives on our hub. And this is just to say very quickly that we capture all public mentions of use cases, and we update this once a month. And as of today, there's 167 use cases across 38 banks that we've captured. And what we can track and what we do track is by which bank and by which function, which focus area, what the impact is expected to have on the bank, and so on and so forth. So do please have a look at least at the last newsletter where we covered all of the summary of that. And if you want to get access to the tracker itself, then do get in touch. And also please respond if you have time to the survey after this webinar. But all to say is thank you so much for your time for a big topic. It will be continued. And for everyone for joining, thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexander.